If we could begin to convene, folks. Thank you. My name is Roger Barber. I was the research analyst with the Revenue and Finance Committee at the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention. I want to thank you for being here. I feel like you're the survivors of this two-day wonderful celebration, and I hope it's not the topic that means there are more empty seats right now. Let me begin by making just some introductory comments about constitutional theory and taxation and finance. From a purely theoretical perspective, a constitution really doesn't have to say anything about taxation and revenue. In fact, two witnesses before the Revenue and Finance Committee during the convention suggested that the Constitution do exactly that, do nothing. And I suspect that that was the only committee that got that advice, do nothing. The reason for that is because a state's taxation and revenue powers are inherent in state government. State governments have the inherent right to tax and to raise revenue. Therefore, if a constitution decides to do something in those areas, it is either stating the obvious or it's placing limitations on the future actions of the state. Obviously, the Revenue and Finance Committee decided to do something. They decided not to do nothing. And the convention as a whole decided to do something. And let me talk a little bit about some of that. One thing they did, which is hidden from view, is that they changed the Revenue and Finance article significantly. In the statehood constitution, there were 3 articles with 42 sections dealing with revenue and finance. The proposal that was submitted to the Constitutional Convention had 14 articles. 14 sections, excuse me. So a significant reduction. By the way, that's not significantly different from the other articles if you look at them. I mean, the legislative article, the judicial article, and so on have about the same number of sections. But what's remarkable is that the committee I worked with took a very wieldy document with 42 different sections and reduced it to 14. If I can quote from the report that the committee made to the Constitutional Convention itself, they said the reason they decided to do something, the reason they decided to propose some sections was for the protection of the people and for good government. The other reason that they gave for doing something was to impose some limits on government. The panel that you'll hear for the next hour is structured a little differently from the panels that you have sat through previously. My panel members will not stand in front of you and give a discussion. Instead, we hope to have a conversation about this article and its impact on Montana in the last 50 years, its successes and its failures. Like all previous panels, this is a very prestigious and knowledgeable group, and you have their short biographies in front of you. I'm not going to repeat them in detail, but we have a sitting legislator who is considered the guru of taxation and finance currently. We have a former legislator who had the same respect and admiration of his colleagues and is now the executive director of the Montana Taxpayers Association. We have a former administrator of the Department of Revenue under Governor Steve Bullock, Dan Box, and we have the Executive Director of the Montana League of Cities and Towns, Kelly Lynch. All remarkable people and very knowledgeable on this topic. So again, what we hope to do is have a conversation. They're going to sit in place. I'm going to propose some topics and ideas, and they're going to talk to you about those topics from their perspective, their significant experience as legislators, as people who have to work with this document, who have to live with this document, who implemented the document as an administrator or live under it as an advocate for local governments. And I'm going to begin, let me just quickly kind of give you an overview and then we'll begin. I'm going to begin by asking the group to talk about the article in, the section in the article that probably generated the most controversy at the time it was proposed and also subsequently. And that's the section that moved equalization and appraisal of property from the local level to the state level. That there was significant discussion by the constitutional delegates themselves about whether that was a good thing, and there have been some attempts since to change it. Next, I'm going to ask the group to talk about limitations on the power to tax. The article that was proposed in the original Constitution had next to no limitations on the legislature's ability to tax. But since then, 2 amendments have been added that limit the legislature's power. One of them deals with sales tax. If a sales tax is ever enacted in Montana, how high can it go? And the other amendment specifically prohibited a kind of tax, real estate transfer tax. Both of them were proposed, again, through the amendment process, one by the legislative avenue, one by the citizens' initiative avenue. The other reason I want the group to talk about that is because there currently is in Montana another attempt to add a limitation to the Montana Constitution dealing with the legislature's ability to tax, and that deals with real property and how much that tax can be increased, CI 121. And again, I think it's important to talk about that because it's a very current issue. I'm going to ask the group next to then look at some topics that generated significant discussion by the constitutional delegates when they considered this article. I went back and looked at the record, and these particular topics were of a concern for the delegates as a group. And eventually they ended up in the form they exist in the document. One of them is the exemption of certain classes of property from taxation, giving the legislature the power to exempt certain kinds of property. Some of the exemptions that are listed in the Constitution were accepted without question, exempting government property, church property, nonprofit property, and so on. But there is a section that says that the legislature has the power to exempt any other classes of property, a very broad grant of power. And there was significant discussion about that among the delegates. Should they be given that broader power, or should we be more specific? Another provision in the Constitution that generated significant discussion was a change in the tax appeal process. Again, it was all at the local level. The Constitution proposed that there be a statewide body that should do that. But there was concern about removing the local authority completely. So again, I asked the group to think about that. And then I do want Kelly especially to talk about the limitation in the Constitution that limits local government debt. So that's where we are, and we'll begin with this very remarkable panel. So let me go back to my initial, my initial introduction. Would the group please talk, again from your experience, about the provision in the Constitution which moved property tax appraisal and assessment from the local level to the state level in Montana for equalization purposes. And I want to begin by referring to Dan Bucks, who has a wonderful story about how that might have come about.
Thank you very much, Roger. And thank you all to the delegates of the 1972 Constitutional Convention for constructing this beautiful and marvelous Constitution, and one of the finest revenue and taxation articles, if not the best revenue and taxation article in the United States. And I feel very strongly about that and feel honored to have had an opportunity to administer the tax system of Montana as Director of Revenue. It was Governor Schweitzer who appointed me, and I served for 8 years in that particular position, and it was a great honor, as it is to be here today. On March 3rd, 1972, your convention debated the brilliant and sweeping proposal of its Revenue and Finance Committee to have the state appraise, assess, and equalize the property, the valuation of all property in Montana. Delegate Mick McEwen of Anaconda, a committee member, defended the proposal, stating, "We heard testimony regarding the local assessors. Local assessment, perhaps, is the greatest evil we have in our system. Local assessors have exerted on them great pressures for favoritism and things of that nature. This is something we must eliminate if we are to have a fair and equal tax system." Now, why would McEwen refer to local assessment as the greatest evil? Now, there were studies in the 1960s of the property tax system, and part of those studies were that there were problems at the local level. The competence of appraisal staff varied from place to place. There were local shenanigans. Assessors would lower assessments to secure more state aid for local schools. Total property values helped actually set the county commissioner's salaries, which sometimes led to a tug of war over those values between assessors and commissioners pulling on opposite ends of the rope to affect those salaries. But none of that, none of those shenanigans really amounts to being evil caused by great pressures for favoritism and things of that nature. What were these great pressures for favoritism? Well, I had the good fortune, as some of the members of this panel have, to have known former legislator Danny Harrington of Butte, who was also one of your convention delegates. And he was a long-serving legislator of distinction and was respected for his honesty and integrity. He told me this story, that in 1977, after your new Constitution was adopted and in place, Atlantic Richfield completed, or ARCO, completed the purchase of the Anaconda Company in mining properties in Butte and elsewhere. And subsequently, this is after 1977, when the Constitution had been in effect, ARCO representatives visited the Butte Silver Bow property tax office, which was now under state direction. And the ARCO representatives told the staff the amount of property taxes they would pay next year to Butte Silver Bow. And the staff was kind of confused by that. And they explained that, well, that wasn't how things were done here. That, in fact, there was an appraisal process and an assessment process of the property, and then the local government set their budgets, which calculated the mill levies, and they would be sent a bill. Well, the ARCO folks said, but that's not what the Anaconda guys told us. They told us we could just go in and tell you what our tax bill would be. That was the evil. That was the great pressures for favoritism. That is what motivated this statewide appraisal system. It's one of only two in the country. Maryland is the other one, but Maryland doesn't have that history. It's a matter of administrative convenience in a very densely populated, small geographic state. This is in the history of Montana as a colony. And so what you adopted with this statewide appraisal system was one matter of achieving self-government, that you would determine taxes on a fair and equal basis. And you did it with great skill and great effectiveness by constituting the statewide appraisal system. You banished this evil, and you didn't do it just through the statewide assessment system. You also declared that taxes are levied for public purposes, not private financial ones. You wrote a strong anti-surrender clause that is often ignored, that says that the power to tax will not be surrendered, suspended, or contracted away. That means to any private party, to any wealthy individual, to any powerful corporation. You went further and required the legislature to establish an independent state tax appeals process with a local component. And the convention intended the appeals process to be truly independent of both taxing authorities and taxpayers, and to focus on tax fairness and equalization of property values, and to maintain the integrity of the tax system free from great pressures of favoritism. You built a structure of tax equity and integrity that you hoped would be strong enough to withstand corrupting pressures from the wealthy, the powerful, or well-connected. And you provided a strong foundation in these ways for this tax structure. And by and large, particularly for agricultural, commercial, and residential property, Montana now has a system that ranks in the top ranks in the country for the accuracy, the uniformity, and the fairness of the assessment of property in any state. You have done a great job with that. There are some problems in other areas that we'll get to, but in those areas, we have a great system. It took a long time to implement it. It wasn't slow. In fact, I would say that it really didn't get fully implemented until into this century. But thank you very much.
I don't know if their panelists want to comment after that strong statement. It's a pretty big pat on the back for the convention.
Only to say that I would absolutely agree. You have to have a centralized system. The evils that existed were politically driven. There were rules of thumbs that existed pre this, that you consistently value property at 40%, personal property at 60%. And so the local assessors tended to have rules of thumb that they followed in order to pull down additional state dollars. And that the rules of thumb varied, some between counties and taxing jurisdictions, but also between the influence of the individual who they were potentially appraising. And so while the state appraisal system may not be perfect, a state appraisal system combined with a local and state appeal process certainly is more uniform and more likely to produce good outcomes than, and with less game playing, intervention, potentially evils, I guess, than one without. So I've always thought that was how it had to be, even though it's not always entirely popular.
I think that
So I don't neglect my duties. For those of you who may not know him, this is Mr. Llew Jones, sitting representative from Conrad.
I think the statewide appraisal was a necessary thing. I think probably the big leap of it was that when it was envisioned in 1972, you didn't have the computer systems to actually do it. I mean, everything was still done on paper back then, and you had to still assess things locally and then get all that data to Helena so that they could aggregate it. And that's still the problem with even with the computer systems with the state assessment system is, we probably won't have time to talk about this today, but one of the limitations that the legislature put on tax raises or tax revenue is is they limit how much local governments can raise their revenue each year on the taxes. But to do that, you have to be able to separate existing property from new property. And that's still a problem in the department. It was when Director Bucks was there, and it makes a difference on how local governments are financed because of that. The way the system works is you get to raise as much money as you did last year plus half the rate of inflation on your old property plus that same millage on new property. And if you can't identify that new property, you might leave local governments short of revenue or have them over revenuing, depending on the issue. But it's a good system now. It has some room for improvement, but I guess the issue was about local influences on an elected official who was doing the evaluation of property. All right, you got an elected person who has to be popular enough to get elected. They're setting the values on the property. Not everybody and not every county in Montana had an anaconda company. Only a few. But the same thing happened in rural counties. And I think one of the telling factors of how bad things were once you went to the state appraisal was how long it took to get through the court cases on the valuation of especially residential properties. Because in some counties you had a significant increase in the value of residential properties under state assessment. And I think that was just kind of the opposite of what the director was talking about, is that local assessors were shifting the tax burden onto commercial properties and industrial properties to be more popular with the voters of homeowners. But the system works fairly well now, and always room for improvement.
I can't speak on behalf of the counties because I'm here on behalf of cities and towns, and we don't have really any role in the taxing process at the local level or the state level. And I think, generally speaking, we think the system in terms of assessment and state is good. One thing I will say is that I can take comfort in the fact that apparently everyone hated cities and towns even back in 1972.
I'd just like to say that by the key indicators as to whether or not the tax system generates values that are in line with actual market value for residential and commercial property, after each appraisal cycle, and it used to be that because technology wasn't there to do the job, it was the appraisal cycles would be several years long, and then there was a system of phasing in the values that some could debate the equity of that. And when we would finally, we were finally able to get the computer technology to the place where we had a high level of accuracy and efficiency, then they could collapse the cycle into, I believe it's 2 years now. And that's much better because it removes this phase-in complication. But to get back to my main point, when in 2009, for example, when we had a problem with the values of property having gone up from 2003 to 2006 very rapidly, and then the financial crisis hit in 2008 and the values began to go through the floor, and we had to get the values valued at January 1, 2009, while it was a moving target in midair. And when we got done with that cycle, and I'm not going to say there's always corrections that have to be made, but when we did the studies afterwards, we hit as close to being on target as I think any tax system in the country came to getting the values right on the residential property, and with a high level of uniformity across the state, not just in one area getting it done well, but others. And consistently now, I believe the assessment studies after the fact show that the system as it's set up at the present time does basically get it as close to humanly uniform and accurate as is possible. It'll never be 100%. But there is auditing and verification afterwards, and it shows a high level of good work being done under that under the statewide assessment system.
And maybe one short comment on what's coming, and then we probably should shift topics, is there is indeed difficulty measuring between old and new property, right? It's hard to sort in a given county or city newly taxable from on the rate of growth measurements. But I believe we're beginning to see the new computer systems and the new tracking systems, the state Department of Revenue, the legislature, the cities and the counties have been working together on this issue and using some of the new analytics at Microsoft BI. We are now starting to see more clearly. In fact, to be totally honest, I had not realized, anecdotally, I know that new growth in Montana is a significant part. But when I looked at the last cycle we measured, it was basically split 3%. Half of the increase was linked to new growth. Now, obviously, that varies from county to county. That's a statewide statement. But the ability to be able to see that, more than that, to be able to look at it in a micro universe where you can look at this in a community, in a taxable district, so you can more fairly speak to what is an appropriate rate of increase. What's driving the tax increase and who pays is important. And I believe we're just on the verge, just some tools where we're looking at. The new director of revenue and some of our staff just sat down and looked at some of the new analytics that we hope to be able to begin to pilot by this session to be able to see very clearly that separation. There's a lot of times numbers don't surprise me much. I've seen a lot of numbers, but I had not realized to the extent that new growth was a driving factor statewide. It'll be interesting when we break it down to area, because obviously you can't make a statewide rule that impacts a county that may not be growing and compare it to potentially Madison or Big Sky, something that's growing rapidly.
The Constitution did not speak to this issue of the setting of local budgets. That's a legislative policy matter as to how budgets are set locally, and that's this breakdown between old and new property. The Constitution spoke to the accuracy and uniformity of the value of the property, and I need to make it clear, I was talking about that, and Senator Jones and Senator Story were talking about an issue that affects local government finance and being able to deal with the limits on taxation applied by the legislature. They're two different topics.
With the panel's forbearance, just to move the conversation along, this is the shortest panel of the celebration, so if we want to cover our other topics, we need to kind of clip along. I would like the panel to discuss the effect of limitations within the Constitution on the state's taxation power. Again, the original article contained next to no limitations on the ability to tax. 2 have been added by amendment since, and a new one is being at least suggested. Signatures are being gathered, I understand, to limit the property tax in Montana. So I'd like the panel members to talk about what that means to the state, to the legislature, from their perspective and their experience. And whoever wants to jump in first can.
Yeah, so the constitutional delegates were right in structuring a language in the Constitution that was very, very flexible. It gave the legislature almost all authority in how to tax. Well, of course, once the legislature has broad authority, sometimes people get a little concerned about that and want to put some restrictions on it. The first restriction, of course, as Roger talked about, was the cap on the sales tax. But the reason for that was that it gets back to, again, the Constitution only allowing you to have one issue in a ballot issue, and so there was a proposal to create a statewide sales tax in 1992, 93, right in that neighborhood. And so when the legislature put the sales tax out for a vote, they also put another referendum out, a constitutional change that said, if you approve a sales tax, it will only, the maximum will be 4%. Thinking, well, that will help people swallow the concept of a sales tax. Well, again, because you had two separate issues you had to vote on, you couldn't tie them together. The 4% cap passed, and the sales tax failed about 3-1. And that's how that cap got in there. The other one had to do with the realty transfer tax. And what happened about 1990, or about 2003 or 5, a bill came through the legislature that would have put a realty transfer tax on the sale of basically ranches to recreational property owners. And that never passed the legislature, but it upset a couple interest groups, and they went to the ballot with an initiative to prohibit that from ever happening again, and that passed also. So those are the two restrictions in the Constitution right now that have been placed since the delegates wisely chose not to put too many restrictions on the legislature.
And I would suggest they were wise in not putting restrictions in there. And we'll use the property transfer tax, but it's the same discussion, is as your taxing systems move through time, you have to adjust. In order to have some degree of equity, you have to be able to make choices. For instance, when the state was primarily natural resource based, we have a system that's really good at taxing square footage and barrels of oil and things we can touch, physical things, because that's what existed then in a natural resource-based state. We could touch those physical things. Well, as we evolve and our natural resource economy, while still significant, is certainly not the part of the economy it once was. There's now a services economy that's significant. We see our main streets in towns such as this. The mall is gone. It's no longer the tax driver. Amazon delivers 5% of the goods. Netflix exists. We're going to access our movies via Netflix, but the blockbusters used to pay W-2 and property tax. So as the system moves forward, we have to have a flexibility potentially not to go back to our main street stores and ask for more and more property tax and to make sure the toilet flushes, to deliver the services we expect, while other folks can drive the roads and deliver goods for free. And so the more flexible the system, the easier that is. But when if there was a weakness that I would argue this Constitution has, is it made the initiative process too easy. And so we've had folks that come in, and who drove that property transfer was a group of realtors that wanted to ensure there was not realtor transfer taxes. Well, today there's discussions as significant amounts of property are purchased sometimes by out-of-state interests that don't include Montana access, as maybe there needs to be some of these type taxes, but a group fairly successfully added a limitation to the Constitution via an initiative process. And I certainly respect the fear of the sales tax, but ultimately as property taxes continue to grow and the amount of physical things you touch maybe aren't as big a part of the economy as the services or the tourist or the other economies, maybe a sales tax combined with a property tax is the more equitable combination. But again, when we place limits on the future, then we infer that we have a vision for the future. The brilliance of this portion was that it recognized that it had to be flexible. And the weaknesses, I would argue, were what we brought in inflexibilities.
Yeah, I certainly agree with everything that Representative Jones said. Property tax is really what the locals rely on. The state relies on income tax and resources tax still to a little bit. And having those options like sales tax and a real estate transfer tax, particularly in the face of a housing crisis, are really options that we should be talking about. Is that the right policy that the state should take right now because Montanans need it? We certainly are a victim of our own success at this point. Did the delegates in 1972 see that Montana was going to be as popular with the uber wealthy across the nation as it has become? But in terms of property tax, that is a very stable source of revenue, which is great for local governments because we need to pay for roads, water, good, clean water. We need to clean the wastewater. We have to pay for schools. We have to pay for parks. These are things that not only do people expect, but they honestly take for granted. I think we've lost a real sense of what our taxes pay for and what types of taxes pay for what and how much those services cost. I don't see any issues with the Constitution the way it was written. I think I agree with Representative Jones. It was very flexible and very open, and that's a great way to approach it. So I hope in the future we can, like with CI 121, restrain ourselves from feeling like a really good fix needs to be put in place so that people can't have these conversations as things change and we need to be flexible to deal with them.
Next, I'd like to ask the committee to talk a little bit about the exemption of particular classes of property from taxation. Again, the article lists traditional classes of property that are exempt from taxation, but it does have the very broad section that says any other classes of property that the legislature may choose to exempt from taxation. And I'd like the committee, from their perspective, the panel from their perspective, to talk about that if they would.
I think that the one crack, small crack, that was allowed in the original Constitution for a creeping in of some of the earlier favoritism and inequities that Delegate McEwen warned against is the language on the ability of the legislature to exempt classes of property. There was a vigorous debate, as you may recall, in your convention about this. And Delegate McEwen spoke up again. But there was a vigorous debate because there was, in fact, a minority report from the committee, from the Revenue and Finance Committee, from Delegates Arts, Driscoll, and McEwen, questioning whether this provision would open the door too wide to tax inequities arising, in Delegate McEwen's words, from special interest groups. And those concerns, I think, about legislative exemption power were prophetic, considering legislative action that has occurred in recent decades. Now, early on, soon after the convention, there was an ordinary exemptions enacted for stocks and bonds and financial instruments, what I would call traditional intangibles that are not integrated and part of the operation of physical property in the state. Now, this is a little bit of a hard concept, but stick with me on this because this is important. But and that's called intangibles. But in 1999, the intangibles exemption was expanded to include with very broad and vague language, more intangibles, and directed specifically that the value of intangible property be removed from the unit valuation of centrally assessed properties. What are centrally assessed properties? They're large corporate properties that are operated across county and state lines. Transportation systems, airlines, and electric utilities, and most importantly for this purposes, telecommunications properties that are run across county and state boundaries. That was enacted in 1999. A few years after 1999, while I was serving in my prior position with the Multi-State Tax Commission, which is a national organization that helps states with taxation, before I was appointed as Revenue Director, I listened to one of the lawyer lobbyists for the telecommunications industry involved in securing the Montana intangibles property expansion, the expansion of the exemption. I listened to him at a conference, not in Montana, but in Idaho. And he bragged that this exemption had essentially destroyed unit valuation in Montana. Now, I was perplexed by these claims. If it were true, it would mean that the values determined in Montana for centrally assessed properties, particularly telecommunications property, would no longer reflect market value, and that it would be impossible to equalize the value of these properties with residential and commercial property in the state. Now, please note that for 150 years, the U.S. Supreme Court, and also in Montana by the Montana Supreme Court, unit valuation, which means taking all of the parts that work together and valuing it as a whole, is considered to be the appropriate and best method for determining market value. But the expansion of the intangibles exemption tore asunder parts of a unit that operated together. Think of a cell phone operation. What is a cell tower worth without the license, the federal license to use the radio spectrum to deliver cell phone service to all of our devices? What is the license worth if it isn't tied to the physical property? The answer is they're basically worthless. The cell phone tower, essentially, if it's close to water, becomes a telephone pole for an osprey nest. And that's the problem with the intangibles exemption. It destroys, as the lobbyist who had bragged in Idaho that he had destroyed unit valuation in Montana, that's what he was arguing. Now, I didn't believe that, but years later, after serving as Revenue Director and having wrestled with making sense out of this vague intangible statute, and having tried to put some reasonable sideboards on it to salvage some semblance of market valuation, I have to concede that the lobbyist was quite accurate. Now, this isn't a small matter. This is a major inequality in Montana. In tax year 2020, a handful of centrally assessed property taxpayers received nearly $100 million tax reduction from this exemption. 96.9 million to be exact, but almost 100 million. And about 81 million of this amount was shifted to homeowners, farmers, ranchers, shop owners across the state. And 16 million represented lost state revenue into the educational systems. Now, I think this is wrong. I think this exemption power was ill-used. I happen to think, though, that you shouldn't bear any blame in the legislature, from the convention, I mean, because, in fact, there is a savings grace here, and that is that you still said that the value of properties be equalized. And no enactment by the legislature can modify the Constitution. The requirement for equalization is still there. I think this law should be either repealed or amended to take away this problem, or alternatively, it should be challenged in court because it undermines the proper equalization that was the primary goal and purpose of the Constitution on property tax matters. So that's where I think this has been one crack in the Constitution that has been taken too far by the legislature, and it needs to be brought back into common sense for equity and integrity of the tax system.
This book here is tax study that was done by the Legislative Council in 1965, and they looked at all the tax systems in Montana, including the property tax system. And one of their big concerns was the issue of exemptions. Well, it wasn't the issue of exemptions, it was the issue of trying to tax property that you cannot identify, find, or value. You know, there's the furniture in your house, the inventory in the store, a whole lot of other types of property. And they didn't raise much money. They took a lot of effort to try to find. There was a lot of inequity because some people reported and some people didn't, and there was no way for the county assessor to go find all that property. So the legislature, or this committee, basically recommended at some point in time you needed to fix that issue. Well, you couldn't fix it under the old Constitution because the old Constitution didn't allow any exemptions. It required all property to be taxed. And so I think, you know, I surmise that that kind of thought process came in front of the convention, that, you know, we can't tax everything, we can't find everything, we can't identify everything, so we need to allow the legislature to exempt some things. Have there been excesses? Well, maybe. I mean, I have a different view than the director on some things, but you know, it's a legislative act, so the legislature can change what's exempt, or they can add to the exemptions, they can get rid of exemptions, and I think that's the proper place for that. You know, there's just to have enumerated exemptions, which were pretty standard, as the director said, you know, federal lands, local government property, and nonprofits, pretty much common sense, but there are a whole lot of other private property types that need to be exempted, as long as you exempt them as a whole class. You know, you can't exempt just a few here and not there. So that kind of drove the discussion in 1999 about intangible property, because a legislative audit came through and said the state's taxing some intangibles and it's not taxing others. So you either need to tax them all or you need to tax none of them. And the makeup of the legislature and the executive at that time chose to tax none of them. Rightly or wrongly, that was the decision that was made. And even when the makeup of the legislature changed significantly during Director Bucks's tenure, that wasn't able to be rolled back. So it's where we are, and like I said, it may be a court case some point in time, it may be a change in legislative philosophy, but it's a legislative decision because the Constitution allowed it to be that way.
I'm concerned in the current environment that it's going to cause some significant problems in the state and more kind of restrictions brought into the constitutions that don't make sense, like the ones that were being discussed earlier. Because here is what's happening right now. The intangible component of everyone's home, which is location value, that's society's perception of the value of the location. That's an intangible, is valued under the market value system. So homes are at market value, but these large centrally assessed properties are now below market value by a significant degree, to the tune of nearly $100 million of tax advantage. And I think it's one of the seeds, quite frankly, that leads to the current tax initiative that's being proposed out there. Whether it makes the ballot or not is not clear. It's tried to jigger the tax system and is unwise in terms of just a concept of what ought to be done. And we could debate the features of it. But in fact, you have to maintain all classes of property, valuing them equal at market value, or for ag and forest purposes equally at productivity value. And we don't have we've slipped back in where we don't have complete equalization of values as between these large properties and the homeowners and the shopkeepers in Montana. And that needs to be restored. That was the vision you had. Yes, you allowed the legislature to make exemptions, but the vision of equalization of property values was the preeminent vision you had, and it needs to be brought back into alignment. And I'm hopeful that it will be reconsidered in the future, because I think it adds fuel to the fire of things that could be proposed and put into the Constitution that are untoward and are arbitrary, and as opposed to something that makes common sense. Thank you.
I'm going to ask the panel to move on. We're running out of time, but I did want to give Kelly Lynch a chance to talk about Section 7. One of the tensions at the convention was between the Revenue and Finance Committee and the Local Government Committee. The Revenue and Finance Committee proposed Section 10, which was ultimately adopted, dealing with local government debt. It says the legislature shall by law limit debts of counties, cities, towns, and all other local governmental entities. At the same time, the Local Government Committee was very interested in improving local government powers and self-governance, and it led to a significant debate on the floor of the convention. So I'd like Kelly Lynch to talk a little bit about that provision and the impact it has on her constituency.
Yeah, thanks. Obviously, I wasn't there, but I would love to hear how that went down, because I think we're still having those conversations today. Not to go back to the previous thing, but I think it's all connected. I think the issue that our folks see with the exemptions in property tax, and same with limitations on debt, is that the state legislature, which is not funded by property tax, are making decisions that impact really the revenues and the budgets of local governments, which do depend on property tax. And without our input and without our ability to control how that impacts. Debt limitation is the same thing. We've got now a debt limitation in the statute that is becoming older and older and outdated every year. As you guys know, with inflation happening, I mean, the fact that you're limiting debt to total taxable valuation has really nothing to do with how much it costs to do tertiary treatment on a wastewater plant, because the EPA is requiring numeric standards. So it's a very difficult issue for us. We are stuck with limitations on property tax that have happened over years. It's not one decision. It's been a long decision over decades. And really this issue of the exemptions, I think, has led us to this current frustration with residential and commercial property taxes, because it's shifted from exemptions over to those folks having to pick up the tab. So I don't know if I really have an answer to it, but I think the fact that we now have things off the table like sales tax and real estate transfer tax just further limits our ability to come up with an answer to help folks who are dealing with property tax problems.
The one big hole in the tax system in Montana, in my judgment, is the lack of a dedicated revenue source for local infrastructure, particularly in the cities and the towns. There is a dedicated source of revenue for the highway system, but there is not for local infrastructure. And that's a hole that the legislature could fill, but it needs flexibility. And we've had a prior discussion here on how things have been put into the article you designed that limit the flexibility of the legislature. But 50 years ago, the condition of infrastructure was not the same as it is today. Our society has not invested in keeping infrastructure maintained in cities and towns in the way it should have. And internationally, we have slipped as a nation. And the federal government hasn't spent money until recently on these particular matters to any significant degree. And this is a policy issue that I think cuts across any kind of other divisions. Maybe we're still yet a bit of a rural state that's not sensitive to these matters. Our desire for a clean and healthful environment requires us to invest somewhat more in some of this environmentally related infrastructure, and we may have more coming with the crisis of climate change happening. But it is a hole in the tax system, and People like Senator Jones, who have rather substantial responsibilities in the legislature at the present time, I would hope would find a way to deal with this. But I think this is a great challenge for the state going forward for its economy and society.
I think that, you know, having legislative limits on debt for local governments and school districts, and they're not the same. I mean, the local government's debt limit is based on taxable or market value, and schools are based on taxable value in a different number. But all those have to be voted levies anyway. You know, you can't bond without a vote. So by and large, I guess if the local people want to limit how much debt they take on, that may be their business. They haven't so far been willing to do that, I guess, because the biggest complaint you have from people is my taxes keep going up, but they keep going up because you keep voting for bonds and levies.
And the property tax system may not be sufficient to take care of our, I'm sorry.
Well, and again, it's the challenge you have is, while the Constitution is eloquent and fairly simple, give or take a few voted initiatives and this exemption clause, and I appreciate its eloquence and simplicity, the property tax system, since that's where this conversation has gone more than the income tax system, the property tax system itself has become complex. And it's complex in a number of ways that not a lot of folks understand it. First, I believe it was Mr. Bucks had made the statement about the relative shift. I will tell you, a lot of folks don't understand. They think that if you cut your residential taxes, they don't understand, well, if you cut one group, you invariably rise another group. Another group has to pay. You haven't cut the spend, you've just made a decision between payers. Then you'll get adept, influential, potentially legislators or lobbyists, or just people that are very knowledgeable that can come in and make compelling arguments. Why, for example, is residential at 1.35% and commercial at 1.89%? And why is that relative relationship the appropriate one? Moreover, why is, let's say, timber at 0.5? Why are there 14 classes of property? And I remember sitting in a similar room, the one Mr. Bucks described, where a lobbyist said, you know, Llew, I bet I can convince more people than you that they're not going to understand it's a tax cut. They're just going to say, well, geez, why doesn't that nice timber guy have to pay less? Well, that's maybe the appropriate choice, but that decision was that residential pay more. And so sometimes when we hold the conversations, the more complex the system, the easier it is for somebody to influence the system in their favor. The more adroit you are, the easier it is to influence a complex system. You know, it works relatively well if you understand it. I'm not sure I agree with all the classes. I've been pondering that lately when I watch new classes come on and find a way to come on at incredibly low front-end values. I listen to the exemptions. I'm not a big fan of how TIFs have went and TEDs. Their original purpose to increase value, because they're a way of exemptions, right? They don't pay their 95 mills to the state, which reduces what we can do to equalize the school. The argument is they'll rejoin the system in the future. Mostly that hasn't happened. You know it's an interesting challenge when we had an entire county apply to be a TIF, a tax increment finance district, to avoid taxes. And so again, the more complex the system, the easier it is for adroit people to work the system. But that's not a fault of the Constitution. The Constitution was fairly simple and eloquent. A few little voted initiatives that I don't agree help with flexibility. A current one that, when you do the math of it, simply is nonsensical. But again, that's where we find ourselves. And I did appreciate the simplicity. To be honest, I'm good at the tax system, but I hadn't really read the history in depth until in preparation for this, and I found it fascinating.
Our time is almost up, folks, but we do have a room for a couple of questions, if anyone has some. Yes. It's former Senator Tao. Thank you. Get your mic.
There we go. Thank you. I sat on the committee that dealt with the intangible properties after the Constitutional Convention that Senator Story was talking about, and some of my best legislative stories came out of that little meeting. But we don't have time for that. I want to make one comment and then possibly a question, but I think that perhaps the statewide assessment was the most important thing that came out of the convention. And I say that very carefully because it was, as Senator Jones has mentioned and some of the others have mentioned, there is no question but what the system was really in shambles. And I think I got the best story to tell you how that really happened, or how that really existed. As you know, the treasurers generally did all the assessment and appraisal of properties. Well, the county treasurers are elected offices. And obviously, in order to get all of the support you want to get, the treasurers wanted to get for their next election, well, if you kind of adjusted those values down a little bit, well, you could make an awful lot of your friends a lot happier. And that happened all over the state. And they also realized that if they got their valuations way down, then the state had to put in more money in the state foundation program. So the schools would benefit, and the county came out ahead. Well, that was happening all over the state. And it was not unusual to have the same house in Billings, Montana, taxed at twice the value and the amount of the same house in Great Falls, Montana. And that was wrong. And let me tell you the story. I was very concerned about this. Talked to Russ McDonough, by the way. And he was probably instrumental in getting that statewide assessment passed in this convention. But I introduced a little bill, very, very small bill, in the 1973 session. This was before the implementation of the statewide assessment, so that was not at issue really in this bill. And I looked that bill up because I wanted to get the exact language. The existing law stated that the property must be assessed at its full cash value. Well, that sounds pretty clear to me. And I thought, well, I just want to add some very small words. And not at any percentage thereof. Well, I thought that was pretty simple. That's all the bill did. I thought that was pretty simple. I didn't do much homework for that. I mean, I knew what it was all about, but I didn't get any people out there. And when we came into the hearing, I was astounded. What happened was everybody came in and said, no, you can't do this. The Department of Revenue said no. The Chamber of Commerce said no. The Tax Assessment Association said no. The League of Women Voters said no. It would be devastating. It can't happen because there was so much confusion in the state of Montana in assessing at that time. It would have been a disastrous bill, they said. And in fact, that was cured by this Constitutional Convention and the statewide assessment. And now, although my bill didn't pass, they now state that it must be appraised at 100% of its market value.
Thank you, Senator Tao. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I know there were a couple more questions, but we need to prepare for the next panel. Thank you very much. Thanks to our esteemed panelists. Good afternoon.